So my focus today is the 11 principles of effective character education. And I have a PowerPoint that I prepared to take a deep dive into those. And so there's something called the Journal of College and Character. I don't know if everybody's familiar with it. It's been around for 20 years. They just celebrated their 20th anniversary. And it is a treasure trove of strategies and theoretical issues and so on that relate very much to our task. And there's, in the anniversary issue, there's a quote from Richard Keeling. It says, "Cultivating humanity, the whole person, is higher education's most momentous task." And I thought that was a good quote for us to start with today. Then the question becomes, how do we do that momentous task? Here's a critique from a school superintendent early in the character education renewal. Said, most character education in his experience was a mile wide and an inch deep. So it's certainly possible to do it in a superficial way. How do we do it in a deep way? How do we create the kind of character education that positively impacts school leaders, faculty and staff, students and parents in significant, measurable, and lasting ways? So that's our challenge. How do we do this in a deep and enduring way? Now, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. That's a line from a famous social psychologist, Kurt Lewin. We need good theory. We need big ideas in order to guide good practice. And a conceptual framework provides a set of big ideas that guide practice. Now, in the character education field today, we actually have an embarrassment of riches. There are many good character education frameworks. Here's just 9 of them. There are still more. The Caring School Community came out of the Developmental Studies Center in California. The 12-point comprehensive approach was what I focused on in my own book, Educating for Character, the 11 principles put forward by Character Ed Partnership, now character.org. We'll take an in-depth look at those. Social emotional learning, still another framework. Most recently, there's a book by Maurice Elias and his colleague to argue for the integration of social emotional learning and character development. That's a brand new book that makes the case for the bringing together those two approaches, those two frameworks. Values and actions stem from positive psychology, and that's made use of the 24 strengths inventory. One of your universities, Lipscomb, I believe, is making use of that instrument. Smart and Good High Schools was work that Matt Davison and I did that zeroed in on what's going on at the secondary level. Marvin's Prime model, still another model. You'll hear from Marvin about that. The Jubilee Center, which the Hope Academy is making use of, and which is spread around the world through the work of England's Jubilee Center. And Robert McGrath's article in Marvin's Journal of Character Education, calling attention to a 7-point prototype that focuses on moral identity as a central construct, how we define the sort of person we are. And McGrath is arguing that that should be much more central in our character education efforts. So all these are frameworks, and they are, in my judgment at least, complementary. And that character education as a field is enhanced by studying and drawing theoretical insights and practical implementation strategies from many of these character education frameworks. So I would encourage everybody here today and everybody that you know involved in character education to do just that. Now, the 11 principles of effective character education is a framework that's been around since the mid-1990s, developed by what was then Character Ed Partnership and updated in successive revisions. You have electronically, in the things that were forwarded, a distillation of the 11 principles linked to exemplary examples in that resource. That's something that should be valuable for you in making use of the principles. Now, the partnership, just a little bit of its history, it was founded in 1993, one of the first national organizations to try to move character education forward in the whole country. And its goal was to create a big tent where individuals and different organizations could come together and pull their resources, their energies, their commitment to character. Marvin has recently taken the lead in authoring a history of the 11 principles, which you can get by sending him an email. That'll be out, I think, perhaps in the Journal of Character Education. And that traces the development of those principles over the last several decades. In the beginning, Character Ed Partnership debated what should be its role in trying to provide advice to schools. Should it try to be a clearinghouse? Principals were getting flooded with materials that were coming in packages and published programs saying, here's how to do character education, and people were just overwhelmed. How do they decide what sort of program to use? And so character education wrestled with that and decided not to do the clearinghouse approach, but rather to try to formulate standards of excellence that would be broad enough to give guidance, but also that is specific enough to give guidance, but also broad enough to allow for diversity, because the creativity of individual schools and districts has actually advanced the art of character education. So we wanted a framework that would allow for that sort of creative diversity. In the introduction, you get the kernel of this notion that there's no single script, but there are basic principles. The sources that CEP used were a couple, the research that I had done for Educating for Character, and a seminal white paper by Eric Schaps and Catherine Lewis of the Developmental Studies Center, which is now the Center for Collaborative Learning. And the Developmental Studies Center really did what became the gold standard for character education research. They initially worked with 3 program schools, randomly assigned to be program schools, 3 other schools that were the comparison groups. It was replicated with a much larger study in 6 different geographical regions, found that there were still program effects. The program stopped in elementary school, but some of the significant differences between the kids who got the program and those who didn't were still evident in middle school. So this was a very significant longitudinal and experimental study, which we drew upon in formulating the 11 principles. The next thing that happened in 1999 is that CEP created a formative assessment tool called the Character Education Quality Standards. And this allowed schools to assess the degree to which they were effectively implementing the 11 principles. And it became, soon after that, the basis for a National Schools of Character Recognition Program. CEP gave that award initially to the top 10 or 11 schools that had to document what they were doing to implement the 11 principles. There were site visits involved and so on. And one of the advantages, one of the benefits of using the 11 principles, if you're become really part of a network of schools across the country that have used the principles, and hundreds now have received this National School of Character or National District of Character award, and you can tap into those resources. So that's an existing national network, all which has made use of these 11 principles. The next thing that happened in CEP is that Kathy Bellin, who was the lead author of a very good published program called Second Step, she was with the Committee for Children. Kathy joined CEP in around 2000, and she spearheaded the development of something that was called the 11 Principle Sourcebook. This was a very big binder that became a training manual that could be used to train district staff, elementary staffs, and CEP did a lot of that training work. Other consultants used that manual. And so the 11 principles had evolved now to provide a definition of character, implementation practices for schools and districts, a way to train character educators, and a tool for assessment. So a framework that had all those elements. Now, the 11 principles fall into 4 groups, each of which addresses a different question. The first big question, which is addressed by principles 1 and 2, is what is good character? Obviously a fundamental starting point. And as we go through these principles, I'd like to challenge everybody to keep in mind 3 questions. Marvin will return to these questions when he speaks. What do teachers and other staff, coaches, counselors, support staff, and so on, need to know? That's the head. Need to value? That's the heart. And finally, do? That's the hand, in order to be effective character educators. In turn, what do principals and school leaders need to know, value, and do in order to help faculty and staff be effective? And then finally, what do we as college professors need to know, value, and do to help teachers and school leaders be effective in their role? So what does all that look like in higher ed? How do we practice what we preach? So here's principle 1. The school promotes core ethical and performance values as the foundation of good character. Now, initially, in the first iteration of the principles, that principle 1 spoke of core ethical values, was subsequently revised to include performance values in order to really encompass the entire mission of schools, to help students have their best relationships and to help them do their best work. The idea that a life of character involves both of those, not only having good relationships, but also doing our best work on the job. And this notion of moral and performance character as interdependent, interrelated, each supporting the other, came out of the research that my colleague Matt Davidson and I had done on high schools who were exemplary in their character education efforts, had received awards sometimes for multiple things. We published that in a 250-page report, which you can actually download from our center's website. The Character Education Partnership co-published that. And since that, even though it was focused on high schools, the big ideas and the practices we reported have been used K through 12. And this notion that the mission of the school is to do our best work and to be our best ethical selves has been adopted now, as I mentioned, up and down the developmental range. Here's an elementary school, an independent school outside of Philadelphia, the Shipley School. When the children come in, they see the mission of the school in simple terms: doing our best work, being our best ethical selves. You can walk into any classroom, kids can tell you what the mission is. Each principle has a brief narrative explanation of the essence of that principle. Here's principle number 1, for example. The schools, the critical stakeholders, come to agreement on these core ethical performance values. Examples of the core ethical values are things like caring, the other-oriented that Anna spoke so eloquently about, honesty, fairness, responsibility, respect for self and others. Performance values include things like diligence, best effort, perseverance, critical thinking, and positive attitude. One way to think of the relationship between moral and performance character that's been useful for us is that moral character gives us the vision of doing good. Performance character enables us to execute, to get the job done. And when you look at lives of character, you see people who have this moral commitment to creating a better world, and you see them having the performance values, the qualities that enable them to actually translate that into something that happens to make a positive difference in the world. Core values, we try to lay out in the explanation, the criteria. We're making a philosophical case. This isn't like values clarification where you can just simply pick and choose the values that are to your taste. This is arguing something that is distinctive and fundamental to character education, and that is that these core values have objective worth. They affirm human dignity. They promote the development and the welfare of the individual person. They serve the common good. They enable us to live together and function as societies and families and schools. They define our rights and responsibilities in a democratic society. They meet the test of universality. Would you want other people to act this way? And would you want to be treated this way? These transcend religious and cultural differences. Now, for each of the 11 principles, they're operationally defined in terms of either 2, 3, or 4 sub-principles. This drills down, makes them more specific. And the scoring sheet that's part of that character education quality standards that I mentioned as an assessment tool gives a 4-point scale. Lacking evidence is 1 to 4 exemplary, on which a school's own staff or an outside evaluator can rate the school on each of the sub-principles. And then you sum all those, you get an average, you get a total score for the school overall. So here's principle 1.1. So this first sub-principle: stakeholders in the school community select or assent to a set of core values. Now that assent to is provided as an option, but my own bias in this area is that you want shared ownership. So really, what's the essential task? It's to get buy-in from the critical stakeholders. So that means ideally you want an inclusive representative group that has professional and other staff, parents, students, community members. They've all had a voice in the process. They're on board, and that everybody understands and signs on. Principle 1.2, sub-principle, is that these guide every aspect of school life. There's a common language. It guides even hiring practice and orientation of new faculty and so on. They're visible in the total school environment. You can see them in the mission statement. You can see them in the website, the student handbook. You can see them in the discipline code, the newsletters that go home to parents, at school events. And then finally, these are really defined in terms of what they look like and sound like in observable behaviors. And one elementary school that I entered had a huge display of the observable behaviors that for them define courtesy and caring, which was the center of their character education program. And so that there's a visibility to the core values. Principle 2 is that the school defines character comprehensively to include thinking, feeling, and doing, head, heart, and hand. We can think of these as the components of character. The values or virtues give us the content of character, but head, heart, and hand tell us the, the psychological aspects. We need to understand them, first of all. That's the head part. We need to care about them and be committed. That's the heart part. And finally, we need to put them into practice so they become second nature. That's the hand part. So the essential task here is the school really doing a balanced and good job of attending to all three? It's very easy to get focused on the head. That's the easy stuff, relatively speaking. Sometimes schools make the mistake of reducing character education to a kind of learning the vocabulary, but you don't really see it in the hearts of students or staff. You don't really see it in the hands of their actions. So the critical task is to tackle all three in a balanced way with equal emphasis. So principle 2.1 rather would drill down on helping students understand them, making sure that they can make the connections to lessons they've been taught. They can explain them and how their the particular behaviors look like, sound like, and so on, exemplify the core values. So that's the understanding part. 2.2 is there's an equal attention to helping students become committed to them. That's the work of inspiration. How do we really touch the heart? How do we inspire students to want to be a kind person, to want to be somebody who has determination, who follows through, who doesn't get discouraged, who's not defeated by setbacks and so on? How do we really inspire them? A lot of that is providing inspiring examples. Certainly the teacher in front of the room, exemplars from literature, history, all fields. And underneath cultivating the desire to be committed to these is meeting the basic human needs. This comes from the work of Dici and Ryan. This is the notion that there are these three fundamental needs that human beings, students including, staff included, have a need to belong. That's the need for connection, a need for competence, to feel effective, and finally for a sense of control in your own life, having voice and choice, that's autonomy. And that when these needs are met, we're more likely to adopt the values, whether it's of our parents or a school, if our basic human needs are being met. If those needs aren't met, we're less motivated. And then finally, principle 2.3 is paying attention to the habits. And this, perhaps in some ways, is the most challenging of the three. If schools fall down, it's really on this sub-principle. They've done work on getting the kids to understand the core values. They've done work on maybe helping them care about them, but they don't really practice them with any degree of consistency. So you don't see it translated. And teachers will sometimes express a frustration. The kids know the right words to say, and they seem to feel that they're important, but then they don't really act upon those in their behavior, in their relationships, and how they do the work of school and so on. So this is an essential task of making sure that there's follow through to the level of habit formation. Now, the next set of principles address how can the school be effective in developing good character. Principles 1 and 2 ask the question, what is good character? What's the content? What are the psychological components? Now, this is the how-to. So these next 6 principles address that. Principle 3 says it has to be truly comprehensive, wrapping around everything, all phases of school life, all areas of the curriculum, all parts of the school environment. And it has to be intentional. It's not accidental. It's not haphazard. It's not just making use of teachable moments. It's a good plan. And then finally, it has to be proactive. You don't wait for something to go wrong. You move forward. You teach what's right before something goes wrong. So this has to embrace all parts of the curriculum, as well as school procedures, how discipline is handled, how conflicts are resolved. How do all these things reflect the core ethical and performance values? Standalone programs can be part of this. I mentioned Second Step is an excellent published program. Marvin's and Mindy Beer's What Works document has reviewed more than 30 published programs that have empirical research supporting them. Those can all be part of the character education initiative, but they do not substitute for a holistic, comprehensive approach. They can be a piece of it, but they can't take the place of a holistic approach. First sub-principle here says intentionality is key at every grade level. So individual teachers, grade level teams, they all have to participate in the planning. The school can point to the plan. It's integrated into every content area. All the subject areas reflect the core and the ethical performance values. And teachers give opportunities as part of that to develop students' moral reasoning so that they can really think deeply about these in their content areas. And there's opportunities to do that in every subject area almost. And it's certainly a priority in how classrooms are run. They're run in a way that meets those three needs that we talked about: belonging, voice and choice, competence, and so on. And teachers make clear how core values underlie the classroom rules. They underlie the classroom management. And that includes also consideration of academic integrity so that we don't neglect that. And it's infused through sports, through all the co-curricular activities. You can see it everywhere. I was recently talking with somebody who's trying to use sports as a key vehicle for moving character education forward in schools because so many kids are involved in youth sports. And he says a big problem is that now coaches are hired as part-time staff and they're really not educators in their hearts. They're concerned more about winning. And so you can get this this schizophrenia between what's going on in the academic realm and in the school, and then in the Friday night football game, you don't see that character exhibited. So it has to be evident in all these areas. My own educator character approach focuses in particular on what we call the comprehensive model, and there's a dovetailing, especially with principle number 3. So I just wanted to mention something that's been useful to us, sort of our character map that divides the life of the school into 9 classroom strategies and the wider school culture into 3 school-wide strategies. And sometimes having that kind of a visual map is a helpful reminder, making sure you are truly comprehensive, that no part of school life escapes the character lens. Principle 4, the school creates a caring community. This gets after the relationships that Anna said are so fundamental, so central to a life of character. The explanation basically says the job of the school here is to be a microcosm of a civil, caring, and just society. That's the kind of world we like to live in. Well, the school has to be a small society that is that kind of ethical learning community. And it does this by creating a community that focuses on caring and respectful relationships. Those happen, first of all, between students and staff. The teacher-student relationship arguably lays the foundation for everything else. The school makes time for one-on-one mentoring. Advisee relationships would certainly be critical in schools at the secondary level, certainly in the college level. Extra help is available. I remember a high school physics teacher, the toughest course that any of us were going to be facing. We had to take the state regents at the end of it. And Mr. Snyder could be seen at the end of every school day, giving one-on-one help to individual students who had some struggle with that regents physics course, which was a real brain buster. So all these ways, the student staff show how deeply they care. But that's not the whole story. Often it's a bigger struggle to get the kids to care about each other and to treat peers with respect, and not only in the classroom, but to extend that beyond. So key indicators include all the kinds of pedagogical strategies, cooperative learning, project-based learning, cross-age mentoring, class meetings that are very useful for developing caring peer relationships. Next sub-principle says that, hey, human nature doesn't go away when we do character education. Weaknesses will remain and people will fall from grace. There'll be stumbles and struggles. So how do we deal with peer cruelty when it happens? Bullying will occur even in the best of schools, physical and emotional. So key indicators here are that teachers and other staff respond swiftly. They don't ignore it. They don't tolerate it. There's no tolerance for peer cruelty. And students participate in many activities that develop understanding, respect, tolerance, peace. And there are programs available. Some of them don't have research support, but Olveas and Steps of Respect are 2 programs that do have empirical support. They don't eliminate bullying. They reduce it by about 1/3, but that's a significant dent in the problem, and school culture can help with the rest of the problem. And then finally, we have to see the same sort of thing among the adults and address that as well. There needs to be a professional learning community where there's mutual support. Staff feel it's a positive work environment. Administration fosters that. There's planning together. There's collaboration in different ways. Parents, community members, everybody who comes into the school, they all feel welcome. Those are the adult relationships, and they're obviously crucial. Some schools have tried to do the character stuff first with the children, and they've neglected the professional community. And then after a while, the light goes on and they think, this is really first about us as adults, and then we can't give what we haven't got. So if we're not experiencing at the adult level, the well is going to be dry. Principle 5, obviously crucial if you're going to get to that third component of character, the hand, and that is there have to be lots of action opportunities and lots of different kinds of opportunities for moral action. And this, again, is probably a principle where many schools struggle. Schools tend to still be heavy on the head stuff. I mean, basically, when we're teaching other subjects, it's largely a cognitive enterprise. Character is qualitatively different. Here, you really are dealing with the whole person. You can learn the skills of math and reading. You can learn how to do math and science. And you can take the tests and perform those cognitive tests. But with character, life is the test. And so you need the opportunities to really get it into the whole person, head, heart, and hand. And those have to be many and varied. Let's see, I need to click twice if it gets stuck, right? And then try again. Okay. The explanation of this, again, repeats what I've just said. And repetition is key, as is reflection. It's over and over and over that forms the habits. The expectations are clear, though there have to be those clear indicators so that students don't have a fuzzy notion of what this looked like and so on. The opportunities have to be, again, many and diverse. Teachers provide instruction that enables students to practice decision-making, academic integrity, conflict resolution, and those go across the board, across all areas. Principle 6 says that the school must provide a meaningful and challenging academic curriculum that respects all learners, develops their character, and helps them succeed. This, too, is a principle where I think, at least initially, some schools do struggle in that the academic curriculum hasn't really deeply integrated the core values. You might see some connections, but you don't see a deep integration across subject areas and across all classroom. And especially at the secondary level, this becomes more and more of a challenge. We did something that was among the frameworks that we looked at in one of the early slides, Smart and Good High Schools, where we had a Templeton Foundation grant to travel all across the nation looking at exemplary high schools. And we found that the initial mindset, even though we saw things that we considered to be good for character development, the typical high school teacher didn't self-identify as doing it. I remember one teacher said, "I teach chemistry, not character. I wasn't trained in this character stuff. I'm trained in chemistry." But then when we watched her classroom, she did all kinds of things to help students care about and respect each other, to help them be responsible for their homework. And she said, "I'm not going to nag you about that. That's your responsibility." To help them find out what they missed if they were absent for a particular day, to use cooperative learning. She was doing all kinds of things. She just didn't label it as character. So sometimes the integration has to be in the mind of the educator. It's going on, but it's sort of at that level of beneath conscious intentionality. And as part of that, teachers are models of this, and they model persistence. They model caring. They show these qualities in how they carry out their craft. There are living examples of that. Marvin, I think, has somewhere in his slides something that I'm excuse me, fond of saying, that is, your most powerful curriculum is the model of your own character. It's the example you set. Challenge is clearly crucial. We want all students to feel challenged and supported. We want them to be excited about how they're being stretched in their classrooms. The curriculum has to provide that combination of support and challenge. We know that works in parenting. We know that it works in education as well. It's the balance between enough support and enough challenge. Part of this principle is paying attention to diversity of culture, learning needs, background, so on, so that we're aware of students as individuals. They feel known as individuals. Parents see that. They feel that their kid is known as an individual person. That comes through in the parent-teacher conference. Students have have that strong sense of connectedness. And the research, the National Longitudinal Study for Adolescent Health, for example, found that when kids feel this kind of connection, when somebody knows them as an individual, it's a protective factor against high-risk behavior, and it's a protective factor against problems in school. Kids tend to thrive across their lives when they feel that connection. And there's a focus on intellectual qualities as well, thinking habits. Here's where the Jubilee Center has broken this out as a particular category of virtues. How do we develop the intellectual virtues? Curiosity, truth-seeking, critical thinking, that support that part of performance character. And teachers, of course, promote that and model that as well. They're also, at the same time, the social habits that are the other side of the coin. Principle 7 focuses on what initially the CEP called intrinsic motivation. There was some debate about whether there's some sort of extrinsic motivation and how is that defined that's useful as contributing to character development. So we shifted the language to self-motivation. But whether it starts as intrinsic motivation, we want it to end up as something inside so that the motivation is coming from within. Because character is what you do when nobody's looking, the old saying. It also is what you do when a lot of people are looking. For example, when your peer group is looking and somebody shows you pornography, and everybody is looking and waiting for you to watch it. Are you able to turn away from the bad example when everybody's watching? And of course, it's what you do when you can get away with doing the bad stuff and nobody's looking. So this is why the intrinsic stuff is so critical. We want kids to carry their character forward into any environment. It doesn't matter how bad the environment is. We want that to be sufficient to overcome the environmental problems. And this is doing the right thing for the right reason. If you ask kids, why do you follow rules? Sometimes they'll say, well, you'll get punished if you don't. Well, you say, is that the character reason? Well, no. Sometimes they'll say, well, you get a reward if you follow. And was that the character reason? Not really. So what's the character reason for following the rules? It's the right thing to do. So the right thing for the right reason. And that requires a lot of work because sometimes kids have come out of environments that have maybe paid them to do chores at home. They wouldn't take out the trash if they weren't going to get money for it. So that their previous experience may encourage them to be dependent upon an external reward. We want them to do the right thing because it's kind. We want them to value kindness, to feel that they would help somebody even if nobody, even noticed they're being kind in the playground. We want them, same thing with their work, to do their best work, not just because of the grade at the end of that, but because they can take pride in it. There's that intrinsic satisfaction that you use your talents. You revised your work. You tried to bring it to a higher standard. You didn't give up, and so on. So across the board, this is where the emphasis has to fall, and this shakes out in a lot of different ways. The character education, the latest iteration of this mentions PBIS, which is very widely adopted, which sometimes in its implementation emphasizes the external rewards. If there is a use of a program that makes some use of external incentives, there has to be a very careful attention that that is not the major emphasis and that you keep moving in the direction of intrinsic motivation so the kids don't get hooked on the rewards, because when those disappear, the motivation can disappear as well. How do we recognize good character? Many schools struggle with this, and they initially have approaches that are not inclusive. I can remember when my son got the student of the month in 7th grade. I thought, well, that's really nice. But then I thought, what about all those other kids who are trying to be good citizens? They didn't get it. So the school was shooting itself in the foot. Several hundred kids didn't get recognized for their efforts in citizenship, and only one kid got singled out that month. So that's a disincentive. So we need to figure out how to make it inclusive. And there are ways of doing that. Kids can set goals, get recognized for achieving them. There are all kinds of ways to celebrate the individual character strengths and achievements of everybody. And sometimes the best way to tackle that is to ask students for their ideas. They can come up with good ways to make sure that it's not just a handful of kids who get noticed. And when just a handful do, I remember being at a school in Canada where when I talked to the school leaders, they didn't like it that they were constantly walking across the stage getting recognition. They wanted other kids to be up there. Opportunities for revision are critically important. If we want students to take pride in their work, then we don't accept the first draft. We give them opportunities to make it better, to benefit from teacher feedback, from peer feedback. So principles 8, 9, and 10 address who's responsible for character education. This is the next big question. Whose job is it? Who provides the leadership? And principle 8 says all staff have to function as a learning and moral community. And we call this an ethical learning community in our work after a while, because that encompasses both the ethical values and the performance values. And part of that functioning, of course, is modeling the core values. And this means everybody. This means, all the support staff. I remember working with a high school that ended up getting, as part of the district, a National District Character Award, Mount Lebanon School District outside of Philadelphia. And the assistant superintendent was wise enough to give me something I didn't ask for. He said, I want you to spend an hour and a half with the support staff. So the cafeteria workers all sat at one table. The custodians at another table. The secretaries at another table. The bus drivers at another table. Everybody was in role-like groups. And I had an hour and a half to ask them 2 questions that I thought of asking them. How do you already influence the values and character of these high school students? What do you do that already makes a positive difference? And my second question was, what else would you like to be able to do that would positively influence? And I can remember one female custodian who said, I stand outside the girls' room and they change classes. And I just greet everybody in a friendly way. I try to learn everybody's name. I think that I'm an example of friendliness and courtesy. And I think I'm making a difference for the kids. I think it lifts their spirits that they get a nice hello from me. So that's something that she already did. Now, another custodian said, my name is Jim Jones. I've had 4 kids go through the school. I don't get a chance to do this, but I'd like to be able to go into every classroom at the start of the year and saying, I've worked here 22 years. Here's a list of everything I got to do every day. And if one of you guys plugs a toilet, that's got to be added to my list. So, I really appreciate not plugging the toilet. I could tell a little bit about myself, my kids, I like to hunt and fish, and they know me as a person. And when they might be tempted to plug the toilet, they think of Jim Jones having to deal with that in an already busy day. So what are the existing opportunities? What are additional opportunities? We want all school staff to feel part of this process. Oops, got to click twice in order to get it going. Back up. There's the modeling. We just talked about that. And that's part of the planning too. We want everybody to be involved in the planning process. That everybody feels voice in that. I remember one school district we worked with where the bus driver was on the district-wide committee, and she was a tremendous. She made sure every bus was sort of a traveling character environment. There were posters. She would greet all the children. If there were problems, before they started out, she'd say, "Guys, start settle down. What do we need to remember about the rules?" So you really want everybody to have voice and responsibility. Time to plan and reflect. That's a recurring theme. 2 simple questions that aren't hard to ask, but do tend to be neglected in the busyness, the hectic pace of school life, is what's working and what can be improved. And that question can be asked in department meetings, in whole faculty meetings. It can be asked in small groups, teachers collaborative planning. It can be asked among people who supervise the playground, what's working, what isn't, the cafeteria, what's working, what can be better. And that's a simple way to keep formative evaluation as well as summative as an ongoing process. Principle 9 talks about school leadership and a long-range effort to support that. And the leadership takes responsibility for making sure there is long-range support and sustainability. And this becomes crucial because we want the here's this key indicator here. Just read it. It said the principal is visible as a champion of the effort, but everybody feels that if the principal left, character education would continue at full strength because there's shared leadership and there's a strong, robust school culture that would endure beyond the principal's departure. I remember one National School of Character that was only 30 minutes from our college. We felt that they were a showcase and so on, but the principal moved on to another city, 3 hours away. And, you know, a couple of years later, we had visitors to our college, said, well, there's a national school character down the road. I called, and the secretary said, we're not doing that anymore. It was gone in 2 years' time. So obviously that's not something we want to happen. So it has to be shared leadership. The assistant principal, the counselor, the school psychologist, teacher leaders all have to provide shared leadership. We want the leadership groups to include all those different folks. Again, that's an emphasis on inclusivity. We want artifacts that are evidence of that, so you can see it manifested in different ways. We want students to help create a sense of community and take leadership roles. A key thing here is student government. Class meetings make this happen within the classroom. But in our experience, a vastly neglected opportunity is student leadership, so that kids really have an opportunity to help govern the life of the school. If there's harassment in the hallways, if there's cruelty on the playground, if there are problems in bus behavior, if there's widespread academic cheating, that's a problem that exists in the peer culture. Adults acting alone can't solve it. So those things have to be put on the desk for people to tackle, for the student government to tackle. And they can do it in concert with adult guidance. Principle 10 says reach out to families. In some ways, this ought to be, you know, farther up front, but because of how crucial it is, we know the family lays the foundation. Sometimes schools get to this late in the game. They don't think early on about recruiting parents as partners. We want them to be part of a character education planning committee. I think the best strategy here is to have parents be responsible for making sure other parents are informed and involved. That way that burden is on the school. But then there's somebody who also sits on the school-wide committee. So I really recommend that as an approach. Schools often offer courses in parenting skills or workshops, and parents volunteer at a high level. That's another good indicator when that's happening. And there's constant communication. Some of the best schools send something home every week from the classroom. Here's what we did this week, or here's what we're going to do. Here's a calendar for the month of all the different things they're going to be happening. So when your kid comes home from school and you say, what'd you do at school today? They can't say nothing. You pull out your calendar and say, well, wait a minute, on Wednesday, it says you're going to have a guest speaker from the SPCA and so on. When new families arrive, they get an orientation to the school's character education mission. And you're constantly asking parents for feedback. That can be done in a simple school survey, so you get some quantitative data to look at there. And then finally, the wider community. I want to reach out to them. I was just with a school in Florida where they said they've just trained their high school students in entrepreneurship. And they brought in several community entrepreneurs who did an absolutely fantastic job of guest speaking and then guiding students through their own entrepreneurial projects. And there's a tremendous amount of moral and character development that went on by making use of that community resource. And of course, the community can provide service learning sites, service learning being one of the most empirically supported character education strategies at every developmental level, elementary, middle, and high. And then finally, how do we assess all this? This is another principle that sometimes schools get to late in the game, but the planning process should begin with the end in mind. So now I encourage schools to start by thinking, how are we going to know if we're making a difference? What are the different methodologies that we can use? And then to use varied methodologies so that you assess the school culture. There are lots of good school culture instruments. You assess the school's functioning as character educators. The 11 Principles Survey, the Character Education Quality Standards enables you to do that. And then to what extent do students manifest good character? There are different tools for that. You can use a school culture survey to get at students' perceptions of others' behavior, but you can also use student self-reports. Don McCabe's work on academic integrity is an excellent instrument that assesses the degree to which students express their attitudes toward cheating. It's a serious matter. Hey, it's no big deal. They have a choice on a 5-point scale, and the degree to which they report their self-report their frequency of cheating. Never, once in a rare time. Sort of a lot, often, most of the time. And so you get hard data on attitudes toward cheating and frequency. Those are anonymous surveys. An excellent instrument for self-report. There are a lot of good self-report instruments. The VIA, the Virtues and Actions Survey from Positive Psychology, gives you 24 strengths. Another good self-report tool Marvin Berkowitz's doctoral student, who's now making a lot of work with schools, Mark Liston, his character growth index, a critical thing. And so all those are important. And let's see, to make it advance, click twice. I'm almost done. Here we go. Can I move that forward? Maybe I'm at the end of the road. What? Here we go. Am I at the end of my time? I guess, no, yes? I have a little more time? All right, how can I get back to my principle number 11? If you could kindly load that back. Okay, thanks. And I'll just drag my thing to the right. I'm not dragging that to the right very successfully, but I can move forward anyway. All right. The assessment has to be ongoing. And, if you're asking those questions, what's working and what can be improved, that's an ongoing thing. Focus groups can be done on an ongoing basis. Let's say you're doing an advisory program in the middle school. I think you want to do a focus group halfway through the year. What's working so far with our advisories? What can be made better? You'd want to do a focus group at the end. How was 8th grade advisory this year on a scale of 1 to 5? What could make it better? What did you like? What didn't you like? How do we change it? When we did our study of smart and good high schools, we routinely looked at advisories. Every school had one or another advisory kind of thing at the high school level. Some met once a week, some met twice a week, some met every day. And they varied tremendously in the quality. Students sometimes I'd be walking with a student on the way to advisory, and they say, I hate advisory. It's a total waste of time. I can't stand it. And others would say that it saved their life, that it enabled them to survive school. It was the high point of their day. You can find those things out just by sitting down and having a focus group. When we've been in elementary schools, we have focus groups with kids that say, how do you like the classroom discipline approach here? And the kids will tell you that it makes them sick to their stomach. They're so nervous. They don't think it does any good. Some kids just make a game out of seeing how much they can get away with before they're set out. So you can very quickly find out what's working, what isn't from focus groups. So you want to do the qualitative stuff. You want to use the quantitative methods that give you some hard numbers to look at as well. But if we don't do regular assessment, then we're shooting in the dark. We can't answer the question, is it working? I remember working with a high school that was very proud of its honor code. It was an independent high school. They had an honor code for most of the life of the school, which was, like a century old. And I just said, for starters in the group, I said, how many people think there's a lot of student cheating? Only a few hands went up. And how many think that there's maybe a moderate level? Oh, a few more hands. How many people think there's, cheating happens with some of the kids? Well, most of the staff felt there wasn't a lot of cheating, but the people who raised their hands that there was lots that we are absolutely deluding ourselves. The kids are cheating us blind. Well, who was right? They didn't know. They didn't have any hard data. And unless you're gathering meaningful assessment data, it's like that sign in the U.S. Department of Education. Supposedly, I haven't seen it, but there's a big poster that says, in God we trust, all others please bring data. So I think there's a lesson there for all of us as character educators. We do obviously want to trust God, but when we're dealing with our programs and want to know if things are working, we have to be able to point to data, qualitative and quantitative. And we want to be looking, again, at those three kinds of things: the school culture, how well are we putting the principles into practice, and finally, the individual student development. Okay, back to a double click, and my slide moves forward. Whoops, wait a minute. Did I get to the end of 11.3? So yeah, that's the student progress one. And we can get at this in different kinds of ways. Understanding. Can you write me a story about perseverance? Can you write me a story about moral courage? I mean, there's a good assessment of understanding. Valuing. Can you give me an example of somebody who has inspired you to be a better person? How did that happen? How did they inspire you? Who's a hero for you? Dennis Denenberg has a book called 50 American Heroes Every Kid Should Meet. And one of the things he's done with 5th and 6th graders if that is having them choose a personal hero, and then to make a plan, how are they going to try to become more like their hero? How are they already like their hero? And then they report to the class on their plan for becoming more like their hero. And then, they maybe at the end of the semester give their final report on that. So they identify in a deep sense with somebody who is truly a character exemplar. That emotional identification is potentially very powerful in affecting our moral identity, our sense of who we are, and all that helps to bridge the gap between the head and the hand. It's the valuing that's the bridge between the head and the hand. The value is the hard part. If you don't have the hard part, you can't get from head to hand very well. So that's principle 11.3. And that's the end of the 11 principles. Now, when schools begin to use the 11 principles in our experience, this is not a comment on the slide that's on the screen, so maybe I'll go back and cover it. When they begin to use them, there's the sense of, wow, this is a lot. You got all these sub-principles, you got all these key indicators, and where do you start? Well, obviously you want to identify your strengths. Where are you doing pretty well? And then pick some areas where you've got some significant room for growth and go after those. Maybe the integration into the curriculum is not strong. Maybe the opportunities for moral action is not so good. Maybe there's not enough student voice. Student government doesn't even exist in a meaningful way. The kids just help to plan the prom or collect cans for Thanksgiving. That's good stuff, but it doesn't necessarily change their character or change the character of the school. So you look at the principles where you have room for improvement, but in time and time again, the potential of case studies, that's an assessment. I was going to talk about that more this afternoon. If you look at case studies of exemplary schools, national schools of character, you can learn a whole lot from about all the principles, but seeing how a national school of character has done it, because they have to document in detail how they're implementing the ethical and performance values and how they're doing that across all 11 principles. But everybody who's used the principles says it is a great process for looking at our school, where we are, where we want to go. It's a lens that brings so many things into focus. We see things that we weren't thinking about before. So it is a very far-ranging instrument. Kara tells me I've got a 5-minute warning, and I'm very happy to find out that I haven't gone over, because with 11 principles, we used to spend, my wife said, be sure to show we used to take a whole day to do the 11 principles in our Summer Institute Character Conference. And it was a 100-yard dash, to get through it in an entire day. We had this big, thick binder. So I thought to myself, boy, I volunteered to do the 11 principles. Am I ever going to get through them? So I'm happy that it hasn't been a time disaster. And anyway, but my last slide is a quote from David Aspey, who's a very fun, I think actually David has gone to his eternal reward. God rest his soul. And whoops, there it goes. Well, anyway, David said, in his mind, a very thoughtful man, very thoughtful educator, he said the greatest danger facing character education is that we will meet severe social problems, and there's plenty of those, just not need to listen to the news or go on the internet, with weak educational interventions. Posters on the wall, quotes on the PA system, award trinkets and so on. And he said, and then when the weak interventions don't bring significant improvement, people say, hey, we tried character education and it failed. So we need absolutely to make sure we're using strong interventions to meet the challenges that we face in our schools, in our communities, in our culture at large. We're at a critical crossroads, I think, in the history of our civilization. We know from glancing history that civilizations don't flourish forever. They rise and they decline. And character education, I think, is hope on the horizon for making sure we go in the right direction and not south. All right. Thank you very much. God bless you all.